Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today we're going to do part 3 of Little Blue Book number 378, and it is titled The Covered Wagon and the West, with Other Stories, written by E.W. Howe. And today we're going to do part 3, which is also the beginning of the story titled At the Captain's Table. Nose is itchy, so here we go. In my long life, most of it spent at sea, said the captain, it seems to me the true tales of adventure I have heard are stranger than fiction. An observation I offer as testimony, rather than as discovery. And most sea-going men, owing to the lonely lives they lead, are extensive readers. As a child, I lived aboard my father's ship, which seemed to drift idly nowhere, but which finally made a port. We no sooner became a little acquainted there than we were off again for months of loneliness, though at times we traveled in company with other ships. With my father, I sometimes went off to these ships, where we were entertained at dinner. We exchanged visits as families of farmers do. As a young man, when I had progressed to second officer, I visited Pitcairn Island and heard at first hand the story of its inhabitants. I do not know it all, and some of it I do know may be inaccurate, but possibly I will be able to relate the essential details. On the 9th of October, 1787, Her Majesty's ship, the Bounty, 215 tons, sailed from Deptford. Turn the page. Sailed from Deptford, England, for Tahiti in the South Seas, with a crew of 40 men. Lieutenant William Bligh of the Royal Navy was in command, and the object of the voyage was to procure plants of the breadfruit tree for the West Indies, where there were many plantations worked by Englishmen with Negro slaves. It was believed the breadfruit would prove a cheap and nourishing diet for the slaves. Lieutenant Bligh, although a capable, brave officer, was irritable, and there were mutterings among members of the crew before the Bounty sailed. Storms assailed the ship as soon as it was fairly at sea, as if indicative of the disastrous voyage. The men were poorly fed, and when Bligh was appealed to, he flew into a violent rage and said he would flog the first man who found fault with the food. The two men who ate with Bligh in his cabin, the master and the surgeon, retreated to their own quarters because of his fault-finding, and on the long voyage to the South Seas the trouble grew steadily worse. Soon after landing at Tahiti, several of the men were flogged for going ashore without leave. Fletcher Christian, mate of the Bounty, had sailed on 2 previous voyages with Bligh, and was only 24 years old. His brother Edward became professor of law at Cambridge and widely known as editor of Blackstone's Commentaries. For some reason, Bligh took a violent dislike to Christian and grumbled at him constantly. Christian was accused of carelessness and of being in league with men against Bligh, and after the Bounty had been loaded with 1,000 bread tree plants at Tahiti and sailed for the West Indies, Bligh accused Christian of petty theft. All the men had secured a large number of coconuts. Bligh imagined that his particular supply of nuts was diminishing. In a burst of rage, he first accused the sailors of stealing them. Then he accused Christian. "I hope, sir," replied Christian, "that you do not seriously accuse me of theft." "Yes, you thieving hound," replied Bligh, "I do accuse you. You combine with men to rob me. You are all thieves alike. You will steal my yams yet. I'll flog you and make you jump overboard before we reach Endeavor Bay." Christian said nothing, but went to his cabin. In the evening, Bligh sent Christian an invitation to dine with him, knowing he had grossly and unjustly offended the young officer. But Christian declined, alleging an excuse that he was not well. That night, April 27th of 1788, Christian took pistols from the arms chest, and, aided by 7 members of the crew who had been flogged, mutinied. Having possession of the arms, the 8 mutineers easily controlled the situation. Besides, the other sailors hated Bligh and liked Christian. As Christian stalked angrily about the deck, covering his prisoners with the weapons, his fellow officers begged him to desist. But he said to them, "You know, I have always been treated like a dog during this voyage. It is too late." Bligh himself made an appeal to Christian. "Quit your mad prank," he said, "and I give you my word of honor that this affair will never again be mentioned by me." "If you had any honor," Christian replied, "things would not have come to this extremity. I intend to put you overboard." Bligh and 18 others, including all of the officers save Christian, were ordered aboard the launch. Several who desired to go with Bligh remained on the Bounty, as the launch seemed too heavily loaded. The men thus cast adrift in the open sea were given a supply of food and water, but no arms except 4 cutlasses. Christian placed in Bligh's hands a book of nautical tables and his own sextant, saying, "That book is sufficient for any purpose, and you know my sextant to be a good one." The launch was then cast adrift, and the crew took to their oars at 8 o'clock in the morning. The nearest land was 10 leagues distant, but as this story concerns Fletcher, Christian, and the Bounty, it is sufficient to say here that, after a long and dangerous voyage, Bligh reached Java with all his companions, save one, who was killed by natives at the first island visited. On March 11th, 1790, they reached England. Bligh being gone, the men of the Bounty set up a cheer as the ship wore round. They were warmly welcomed at Tahiti, where they arrived the 39th day after the mutiny, but Christian gave notice that he would not remain there long, after securing livestock and provisions. Accordingly, after 10 days, Christian set sail, carrying a great number of goats, pigs, fowls, dogs, and cats, also a bull and cow Captain Cook had left at the island and for which the natives had no use. After a voyage of a week, the ship stopped at the lonely island of Taubua. The men remained there a little less than 3 months, owing to troubles with the natives and to discontent among the members of the crew who had not been active in the mutiny. These said they were not content to spend their lives in Tuba, and there was talk of mutiny against the mutineers, which might have succeeded had Christian been less popular. The sailors built a fort at Taubua, and Christian did as much of the rough work as anyone. On the 17th of September, the Bounty left Taubua. 6 days later, it reached Tahiti, where 16 of the men left the ship for good. These included several who had been active in the mutiny, while some who remained on the Bounty had no part in it. Christian divided fairly with those who concluded to desert him, giving them arms, ammunition, tools, 3 gallons of wine for each man, etc. Christian went ashore, telling the sailors who had no part in the mutiny that in case Bligh reached England, a warship would certainly be sent to look for the mutineers. He advised them to surrender, saying he alone was responsible for the mutiny. 2 of the men who went ashore at Tahiti, Thompson and Churchill, were killed in brawls with the natives. The other 14 remained there, with varying fortunes, until March of 1791, when HMS Pandora arrived. Coleman, Stewart, and Hayward went aboard at once, and Captain Edwards put them in irons. During their stay at the island, the sailors had built a schooner 33 feet long, which they called the Resolution, and in which they intended to make an attempt to reach England. A number of the men were absent, making a tour of the island, when the Pandora arrived. These were hunted down and placed under arrest with the others. One of the officers on the Pandora, named Hayward, had been a midshipman on the Bounty, and he escaped with Bligh to England. The 14 men at Tahiti being secured, the Pandora began a cruise among the neighboring islands looking for Christian and the Bounty. While so engaged, the Pandora was wrecked. 31 of its crew and 4 of the prisoners drowned. The survivors, 98 in number, in 4 small boats, reached Java by almost exactly the same route traveled by Bligh and his companions. On reaching England, the 10 prisoners from the Bounty were placed on trial for mutiny. 4 were discharged, as having no part in it, but the other 6 were found guilty, with strong recommendation for mercy for Hayward and Morrison. In a short time, these 2 were pardoned, and the other 4 hanged. Jeez. The trial of the 10 men attracted much attention in England. Fletcher Christian, leader of the mutiny and still a fugitive, had powerful friends, and they attacked the brutality of Bligh in Fletcher Christian's interest. The Resolution, the little schooner built at Tahiti by the sailors, accompanied the Pandora on the voyage in which the latter ship was wrecked. The 2 vessels became separated during the storm, and when the survivors of the Pandora reached Java, they found the Resolution quietly at anchor. Afterwards, the little vessel was the means of saving the crew, 112 in number, of the ship Providence off the coast of Formosa. It is also a matter of history that the Resolution made the quickest trip on record between England and the Hawaiian Islands. The English government did not forget its determination to help the planters of the West Indies, and in 1791 Bligh was back to Tahiti in another ship, collected 1,200 bread tree plants, and took them to the West Indies. Later, Bligh was appointed governor of New South Wales, where he was so tyrannical and unreasonable that he was the subject of a military mutiny. Still later, he was made an admiral in the British Navy, but resigned so soon that many thought this was part of an agreement. But the history of Fletcher Christian and his companions is most remarkable of all. They left Tahiti a party of 28, 9 of the original crew of the Bounty, 7 native men, and 12 native women. Among the books on board the Bounty was Captain Carteret's Voyage to the South Seas. Christian read this book's description of the loneliness of Pitcairn Island, only 5 miles in circumference, and as it was little known among sailors, he determined to hide there. When Christian reached Pitcairn, he found that Captain Carteret, in his book, had carelessly placed the island several degrees south of its true location. That was another fact agreeable to a hunted man. There was no harbor at Pitcairn, and the surf beat violently on its shores. After the landing, everything of value was removed from the Bounty, and the hull sunk in deep water. Content and prosperity at first attended the mutineers, for they had brought plenty of livestock and all necessary stores to the uninhabited island. But at the end of 3 years, a sailor named Williams took the wife of Took the wife of, these pages are terrible to turn. Took the wife of one of the Tahitians, William's own wife having been killed in an accident. This act caused the Tahitians to resolve to kill the Englishman, and Christian and 5 of his companions, including Williams, were murdered treacherously, leaving 4 of the original 9 alive. These 4 men soon managed to kill all the Tahitian men. McCoy and Quintal, 2 of the most ignorant survivors of the white men, fell into dissipated habits. McCoy had been employed in a distillery in Scotland and found at Pitcairn a root from which he could distill an intoxicating liquor. After that, McCoy and Quintal were usually drunk. McCoy finally fell from a cliff and was killed. Quintal then became so much of a nuisance that Young and Adams shot him. Edward Young and John Adams found a Bible and prayer book Fletcher Christian had been studying and were converted to religion. In 1800, Edward Young died of asthma, and John Adams found himself the only man in a community of 36, the others being women and children. For 25 years, no sail was seen by the inhabitants of Pitcairn in the lonely seas surrounding them. But one day, at the end of the long period of time, the American ship Topaz approached, being short of water and provisions. A canoe went off to the Topaz, and the occupants were handsome young men who talked English. The captain went ashore, and John Adams assisted him in obtaining supplies. Adams confessed that he was the sole survivor of the lost crew of the Bounty, only one of whom had died a natural death. The islanders went aboard the ship, and one handsome young man said, "I am Thursday, October Christian, son of Fletcher Christian, the mutineer by a Tahitian mother and the firstborn on this island." Thursday, October Christian was named for the day and month of his birth. He married the widow of Edward Young. The young people who visited the Topaz were polite and intelligent, as well as good-looking, and being invited to dine, said a grace taught them by Young and Adams. On being shown strange articles on the ship, the young people would say, "We know what that is. We have read about it." They had a library of books taken from the Bounty, and Adams had conducted a school for years. The romantic story of Pitcairn Island slowly spread over the 7 seas, and other ships stopped there at long intervals. The islanders had plenty of pigs, goats, fowls, and vegetables, and when white sailors landed, the young people of Pitcairn regarded them as kin, and made much of them. John Adams, sole survivor of the original 9, died in 1829, age 65, highly venerated as pastor and teacher. The English government had long known he was there, but as he had not been directly concerned in the mutiny and was living an exemplary life, he was not molested. At this time, Pitcairn had 87 inhabitants. Soon after the death of John Adams, there appeared on the island G.H. Nobbs, who succeeded Adams as pastor and teacher. Nobbs also had a considerable knowledge of medicine and therefore became very important and useful in the Pitcairn community. He married Sarah Christian, daughter of Fletcher Christian, and later in life he made a priest of the Episcopal Church, going to London for the purpose. While in London, he was received by the Queen and preached in one of the famous churches. Nobbs was originally a seafaring man, a mate, and went to Pitcairn because he had heard many alluring accounts of its colony. The strange story of the Pitcairn Islands had become so widely known by this time that the great outside world began to take an interest in them. The English government decided that the community had outgrown the little island, and all the inhabitants were removed to Tahiti. But the people soon tired of the change and went back to Pitcairn. A curious chapter in the history of Pitcairn relates that in 1843, an adventurer named Joshua Hill arrived there and claimed he was a representative of the British government. He was a tyrant and not only ordered some of the gentle inhabitants whipped, but told Nobbs, a useful and popular man, to leave the island on pain of death. After 3 or 4 terrible years, it was discovered Joshua Hill was an impostor, an adventurer who had drifted in and, realizing that the inhabitants of the island were innocent and isolated, took possession. At a time when the island had 180 inhabitants, it was visited by a British warship. The ship's band was taken ashore, and there was a great celebration. The people of Pitcairn loved music and were capable singers, having been taught by Nobbs. Every sailor who went ashore was surrounded by pretty girls who put their arms around him and said, "We love you so much. You are our cousin." These descendants of mutineers and native women were gentle, temperate, and well-behaved in every way, and made up what was widely regarded as a model community. In 1858, it was again decided that the population of Pitcairn was too large for the island. The English government at this time was just abandoning a penal colony on Norfolk Island and offered the Pitcairners the place with all its buildings and livestock. The offer was accepted, and 200 or more inhabitants were taken to Norfolk in a government ship. 2 families named Young soon became dissatisfied at Norfolk and returned to Pitcairn. These increased in numbers until the island had 175 inhabitants. At long intervals, a sailing captain announces he had been at Pitcairn, and the Associated Press sends out the news. But no ship visits the island regularly, as it is off the main traveled roads of the sea. The last captain was there referred to it as a happy isle, where the people were temperate and kind and nature bountiful. And there they will probably remain until the end of time. The sequel of the true story, stranger than anything the active mind of man has been able to invent. And that is the end of the captain's, what is it? What story did we just read? The Captain's Table, I believe it was. Yes, The Captain's Table. And it looks like the last story is just a few pages long, so I think we'll get into it. So the last story is called The Old Spider. And I'll start it as soon as I drink my water. Hydrate, kids. Nobody likes cottonmouth. The Spider. I once knew a banker generally called the Old Spider. Actually, one of the best and most useful citizens of his community, since he benefited rather than harmed all those he knew. One of his best traits was ability to handle foolish and excitable people when they attempted too much. I happened to be in his office when a man named Wint Taylor called on a mission beautiful to talk about which could not be defended in common sense. I'm not sure what that sentence meant. Wint, the banker gravely said, "You have here the germ of a good idea. But is the way you propose carrying it out the best way?" He easily out-talked the caller, satisfied him, and made an arrangement for later discussion. In the course of a few weeks, and after further enlightenment from the Old Spider, the foolish plan was given up. The sensible man talked it out of existence in a friendly way. The Old Spider did not offend foolish, extravagant, or careless people. He out-talked them. I had known him to do it hundreds of times. He attended every polite meeting and, after the usual excited and on-sound discussion, had the last word, and somehow managed to bring the crowd around to sanity. He always talked grandly of his fellow citizens and of their progressive ideas, and they all liked this, and admiration for the banker was general. A citizen as honorable, sensible, and useful as he was will not fail of administration anywhere. But finally, the old spider had common sense and caution. His bank was the first place to which all the collectors and schemers applied, and this was fortunate, since he was usually able to talk the nonsense out of the proposals. In case of a worthy enterprise, he eliminated the waste. He had great charity for those who knew less, a wide acquaintance, and was generally accepted as a man of probity and intelligence. Thus, he gave every day a great amount of sound advice to those much in need of it. He had been a farmer, and few farmers know more about their calling than he did. He saved many a man from making mistakes that would have proved ruinous. Few men knew more about simple law propositions or had a greater store of clear common sense. In most towns, there is a steady old doctor, widely respected for sound judgment in matters of health, and who is consulted finally in every real emergency. The old spider enjoyed this reputation in finance. Every considerable venture was delayed until he had looked it over and passed an opinion. The amount of good he accomplished in this way must have been enormous, and no one ever paid a penny for it. The banker's family life was correct, and he managed his wife and children as he did the citizens of his community. If his wife had an extravagant notion, he talked her out of it, amiably, and extended like assistance to his sons and daughters. Before engaging in banking, he had operated a general store where nearly everything might be had, and his feats in salesmanship were talked about everywhere. If a young man became widely acquainted, it was announced by people saying, "He knows nearly as many as the old spider." And all his acquaintances had been customers in the general store or bank, and his transactions with them of such a nature as to result in friends. People watched his habits in everything and fashioned their own accordingly. He was known as one of the pillars of the church, but it was once discovered he was not actually a member and rarely attended except when one of his children was married or a friend buried. Pastors frequently consulted him, and he gave sound advice in church matters, as he did in everything else. Altogether, I am disposed to believe the old spider was about the most unpatronable citizen I ever knew. But that word was really hard. And that's the end of that story. And this is the end of part 4 and the end of Little Blue Book number 378, titled The Covered Wagon and the West, with other stories. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next Little Blue Book.